We Unitarian Universalists describe ourselves as a faith without a creed. We usually concentrate on that lack of a defining creed, the fact that we do not base our religion on upholding a particular religious belief system. And that's a good thing because it frees us to be in community with others despite our varied personal beliefs. It also allows us to be free from what many of us felt was a stifling orthodoxy in the faith community we grew up in. This creedlessness was what drew many of us here and has kept us coming here week after week over the years. But this morning, I want us to take a look at that other part of us being a faith without a creed and ask, what is the faith of a Unitarian Universalist? I believe it is rooted in the difference between what we would call liberal versus conservative religion. The way I see it, conservative religion would tell us that we are inherently bad and must be saved through acceptance of a particular theological belief. Liberal religion says that we are inherently good and that our goal is to bring out that goodness more and more. In 1976, Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams wrote an essay called The 5 Smooth Stones of Liberal Religion, detailing these other key points of liberal religion. Number 1, revelation is continuous. We're always learning new truths. Thus, we talk of a living tradition that is constantly building on what has come before. 2, all relations between persons rests on mutual free consent and not on coercion. 3, liberal religion is embodied in a just and loving community, which says that we can't do this on our own. It's much better when we do it together. And number 4, it requires not only the power of thought, but also the power of organization and the organization of power. The faith of the liberal must express itself in society, in forms of education, in economic and social organizing, and in political organization. Without these, freedom and justice and community are impossible. And finally, Adams tells us that liberalism holds that the resources that are available for the achievement of meaningful change justify an attitude of ultimate optimism. In our 1985 General Assembly, these concepts were codified and adopted as what became known as the 7 Principles, a set of shared values which appear in the front of our hymnals and which, as member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, we covenant to affirm and promote. You'll see them in the chat window of your screen. You can read them with me if you like. These are the inherent worth and dignity of every person, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, acceptance of one another and encouragement to spiritual growth in our congregations, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large, the goal of a world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all, and respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Now, all of these values have been under attack for some time, but over the past 4 years, this has escalated to the point where it threatens the very existence of our democratic form of government. At the same time, a rising tide of wanton violence and a series of high-profile killings of Black men and women at the hands of police has fueled the Black Lives Movement and a renewed push to end racism in a culture that sees white as superior. In the fall of 2017, the Reverend Susan Frederick Gray, our newly elected Unitarian Universalist Association president, wrote her reaction to all this in our denominational magazine, UU World, in which she said in part, "This is no time for a casual faith. The heartbreak, anger, and fear of this increasingly repressive time are real. The losses for individuals and communities are real, in particular communities of color, immigrants, trans people, people living with disabilities, children and families facing the loss of healthcare. The losses are real for all those impacted by the natural disasters caused by climate change. In this time, we need strong and healthy religious communities where we can bring our heartbreak and our anger, beloved communities of connection and ritual that help us build resiliency and courage. Strengthening our commitment to our communities builds a foundation for brave and loving ministry and action in this time. No time for a casual faith was the theme of her president's report to our 2018 General Assembly in Kansas City. And at General Assembly in Spokane, Washington, a year later, what emerged from that framework was a call for us to UU the vote in order to better fulfill James Luther Adams's charge to enshrine our liberal religious values in the laws and institutions of power in this country. Our democracy is under threat by the same forces that have not just marginalized people of color, but created a climate where civil rights and human rights have been set back at least 100 years. Unitarian Universalists are responding in several ways, as evidenced by the programming at this year's General Assembly, which I attended last month. Of course, for so many of us, attended has taken on a whole new meaning lately. General Assembly had been scheduled to be just down the road in nearby Providence, Rhode Island, but had to be moved entirely online due to the coronavirus pandemic. The fact that our UUA was able to pull this off in just 3 months is nothing short of a miracle. At virtual GA, voices of those who are bearing the brunt of repression and violence that Susan Frederick Gray listed were put front and center, not just so that their stories and their anguish could be ignored, but also so they could tell us from their point of view what needs to be done. And there were many workshops aimed at helping us to end racism, not just in our communities, but within ourselves and our churches. I attended 4 of them, and I'd like to share with you some of what I learned. There was general agreement that getting in someone's face and arguing with them is not the way to go about ending white racism. Reverend Keith Crone took a particular look at the dynamics of ending racism in our churches. He noted that there are what he called 4 classes of people, and he went backwards in numbers. So the 4s are those who don't recognize that there is a problem at all with diversity and are satisfied with the way things are. His number 3s are those who welcome diverse people as long as they basically act like us. The 2s are those who are willing to change somewhat, but want to keep the same systems in place. And 1s are those totally committed to uprooting the status quo and commit to inclusion and diversity in full. The point that really stuck with me was his assertion that it is very hard for a committed 1 to talk to a 4 without driving that person away. And that is in fact better to have our 3s talk to the 4s to at least move them towards a recognition of the need for that diversity. The theory is that over time, the 4 can become a 3 and then a 2 and take it as far as you can to get to 1. Another workshop, actually there were 2 of them, I attended was by a gentleman named Chris Crass, who is a diversity trainer, very dynamic speaker. His goal is to, as he puts it, end white silence on racism. But he is not for engaging with the person who argues that there is no white racism, who is most stuck. He advises that we go after those who are in what he calls the movable middle. The most important thing is to not be thinking about that other person who really annoys you when you're talking to the movable middle person. Don't say things like, how could you not know that? And how could you be so racist? Or, where were you before? Instead, he advises that we build a relationship to the point where you can say something like, you're really important to me. And I really care about you. And I want to share with you something that's important to me. This is what he feels will move white people from a posture of leaning back with arms folded to wanting to learn more. One commenter at the workshop said that the current situation has softened resistance among this movable middle, saying that we are in what she called a liquefied moment where people can shift and If we don't dive in, it may re-solidify before we can take advantage of this. And this idea resonated with the group. But I have to say that the workshop that moved me the most was the one that closed out General Assembly for me. It was on an approach to ending racism called the White Ally Toolkit. David Campt is a Black diversity trainer who bases his approach on the concepts of nonviolent communication and the neuroscience of persuasion. When Allison Mahaley, a white UU minister, attended one of his trainings, she immediately saw how closely David's work aligned with the values of liberal religion and suggested that they work together to frame David's science-based approach along the lines of our UU principles. Their trainings take many hours, but the quick take is that they use what they call the RACE method. That's an acronym that stands for reflect, ask, connect, expand. We begin by first taking the time to look within ourselves to make sure that we are approaching this from a mindfulness state rather than anger. Only then are we free to engage with people by asking questions, giving those people a chance to air their views so that, having been heard, they'll be more open to connecting with you based upon areas of mutual agreement and common humanity. And then finally, the stage is set for you to expand their understanding of race. This approach resonated for me the way a book I've been reading has. It's called The Inner Work of Racial Justice, Healing Ourselves and Transforming Our Communities Through Mindfulness by Rhonda V. Mcgee. She's a tenured law professor at University of San Francisco, as well as a practitioner of MBSR, which stands for Mindfulness-Based Stress Reduction. What I like about this book is that she explicitly talks about what I think is an important aspect of this work that I didn't hear as clearly from the workshop presenters. She calls it emotional awareness, a recognition that most people will feel strong emotions in reaction to what others share about race, as well as when they reflect on their own experiences. Her prescription is a meditative moment she calls the pause, which is aligned with the same Buddhist philosophy as the reflect part of the White Ally Toolkit approach. To wrap up, preserving our democracy and ending racism have never been more tightly bound together in our lifetimes. We will bring more people into our UU the Vote effort if we have faith and keep in mind the basics of our liberal religion, that each of us is inherently good. And if that's not what we're seeing in front of us, it's because something else is blocking or obscuring it. In our prelude, Will Ryan sang the Bob Marley lyric, "None but ourselves can free our mind." We can only commit ourselves to doing the inner work of racial justice. As for others, liberal religion may not be coercive, but we can apply its values to create conditions that will make it much more likely that others will do the same work. Rooted in all the good that has come before us in Unitarian Universalism and inspired by voices old and new, we will be ready and able to rise to meet the challenge that lays before us. There is more love, more hope, more peace, more joy somewhere, and we're going to keep on till we find it. May it be so.